Thanks for joining us this morning. It's really great to be hosting our second panel discussion in our summer self-awareness series. The purpose of this conversation that we're having over the summer is to really try to gather leading experts and practitioners that are really working at the interaction between self-insight, talent development, and technology. And so today I'm super excited to be joined with Dr. Jessica Foster and Lara Menke to really help us answer, why does talent development start with self-awareness? So for those of you that don't know, Jessica is a senior partner and practice leader of Executive Bench at RHR International. She has an extraordinary amount of experience working with some of the largest enterprises in the world, helping them build more scalable and effective leaders. Lara, having previously worked at YSC, Korn Ferry, Egon Zehnder, she recently founded CAIA. CAIA is this amazing consultancy that is working with founders and entrepreneurs to really help them build out their leadership skills and ability to build innovative teams in these small startup environments. So I think there's this really interesting perspective among our speakers. Although they have this shared focus on growing talent, they have dedicated their careers to working in very different environments. So Jessica at the kind of global enterprise level, with Lara kind of working with startups and nascent ventures. So as we start to explore kind of self-awareness, talent, and kind of how these two things are related, I think this will lead to some interesting discussion and some nice counterpoint. Before we begin, I'd just like to ask you to remain muted, just so the speakers can be heard. But please do post any questions in the chat. I'd love to kind of hear your thoughts and questions and put them to our panel. We'll be saving some time at the end of our discussion to have a bit of a Q&A. So with that, let's kick this off. The first question I want to ask Jessica and Lara is, what does self-awareness mean to you? Lara, do you want to take a stab at that one first?
Yes. So for me, self-awareness is this feeling of knowing yourself deeply. So it's about a combination of inner awareness and introspection, and also external awareness. So knowing how you come across, the impact you have, and ideally you want to minimize the tension between the internal and so for me it's an ongoing process of discovering who you are, but also creating who you want to become based on the fact that you don't live in isolation, you live with other people, so external perception does matter. So it's kind of this combination.
Very nice, very nice. And Jessica, what about you?
I think Lara's really spot on. We think of it really similarly. I think the focus in our work is very much about the impact of those things. So not just describing who we are, although that's the critical first step, but really understanding how the system experiences us and the closeness between how I think I show up and the ways people experience me, and in reality, what others would say about me and how the impact that I have on them.
I really like that comment around like the impact of us on the system. So how does like this intimate aspect of our own self-awareness kind of play out, manifest, and kind of have this dynamism with these organizational systems, which can be so far away from anything related to self-awareness, but there is this connection between the two.
Right, yeah.
And so then, like, what does it like mean to be self-aware at work, and kind of what are the consequences when we lack this deep understanding about ourselves and how we're coming across to other people?
Yeah, go ahead, Lara.
No, you go ahead.
You know, when you look at a group of leaders at the top of an organization and you measure them on something like personality, and then you experience the culture they've created and the norms around them, you start to realize that they're very similar. That if you understand a group of leaders, you understand the culture they create. And so that self-awareness can tell you a lot about what kind of environment are you creating. And when a senior team or a senior leader lacks that self-awareness, you see a real disconnect between their intent. They want to create a culture that is positive and risk-taking and entrepreneurial, but in fact they create one that's fearful and avoids risk and manages mistakes. And so the disconnect between the culture that we want can really manifest when we don't understand the impact we have as leaders, when our self-awareness is low.
Interesting. And Lara?
Yeah, similar to what you said. It's, for me, being self-aware at work means knowing where to use your energy at the best. So knowing where you're going to thrive, which projects, which team members, which environments are you going to thrive in, and communicating that so that you can have the best impact. And if you don't know yourself, then it can be very frustrating or energy draining for you and the people working with you. So you're probably not going to be delivering the best impact or performance.
Yeah. And so to that point, Lara, like how does that manifest itself in these startup environments, right? So you have leaders that, well, first off, they may not consider themselves to be leaders. They're kind of, say, product guys or girls that are kind of wanting to build cool things, bring it to the world, and, you know, have an impact. However, they are unlikely to kind of think about, okay, what does their behavior mean for when they're building this founding team and so on? Could you kind of explain what that kind of looks like?
Exactly. I mean, a very common what we see is overconfidence in founders, because you have to be somewhat overconfident to take that risk and start your own business, even more so than I've experienced before working with startups. So that means that often they have really, really good intention. They want to create a very innovative culture that is different and disruptive from the corporate world. They have fantastic intentions, but similar to what Jessica said, there's a massive gap between their intention and how they come across, because, for example, overconfidence means talking more than listening. So it means that you're more likely to have biases when hiring talent. So hiring people that are just like you, not diverse. And so common mistakes that actually can be very, have a really bad impact on the performance and the sustainability of the startup.
Yeah, I think it's just so critical to get that bit right. As you're building this thing out, this kind of ever-changing kind of small team organization, and trying to, you know, bend yourself towards success and everything's already stacked against you, being able to truly understand like what your limitations are and not kind of fall into that overconfidence bias that entrepreneurs often have, and finding ways to kind of mitigate that.
Yeah.
But then Jessica, like, how does that kind of ring true in, say, global enterprises as well? Like, is overconfidence still a challenge, or are there kind of other kind of biases or things that these types of leaders need to be aware of that can impact the effectiveness of their organization?
I think what's similar is very much to what you said, Lara, that if you have kind of the hubris to think, I think I got my handle on a $50 billion business, it's not a problem. Like, I've got this. I mean, who thinks that? Who gets up in the morning? But you have to kind of have a certain degree. It's a little like politics, to believe that you've got the answers to solve the complexity of problems around the globe, day in and day out. And so it does come with the territory a little, and it can be an asset, but when overplayed, when you forget to find the moments of humility that allow you to tap into other people who have different sets of strengths. And I think what's true in both cases is we're all really good at some things and not as good at others, and we can't be good at all of them. We all have lumpiness in our strengths and weaknesses. And so if you can just be super honest about those and find other people who are so much better at those things than you are, actually it makes your life a lot easier. And if you try to do all of those things yourself, it's exhausting. And but the other pattern we see in corporate settings is just that people's career paths often are a function of inertia. And I think that you just move up a pattern, you move from one role to the next, you're tapped through some kind of succession process, you find yourself on a train and someday realize, I don't actually think I'm really enjoying what I'm doing that much. Or, you know, I got in this to be an expert in real estate, and now I'm managing real estate, but I haven't done a deal in 10 years. And sometimes we're not actually that real about what we enjoy doing. We just kind of got stuck on a path.
Yeah, I think that's so easily done, right? We can kind of sleepwalk our way through things. Like we think much more kind of biased towards the short term, like, oh, this seems like a good opportunity now because I'm getting, you know, X amount more responsibility or this pay rise or whatever. But to that point then, given kind of how much, or it feels like there's more uncertainty kind of in just the market in general, like in terms of what careers are going to be relevant in the future, kind of what is the impact of automation and so on. Do you think like being self-aware is increasingly more important, or has it always kind of been just as important? We're only kind of just now waking up to the fact that this is a competency we should all be trying to kind of build up within ourselves?
I think that it's again a bit of both, because it's uncertainty is a fact, and I think it's been a fact before. We've just become more aware of it, but we lead very diverse lives. Most of us, anyways, travel a lot and surround ourselves by new people a lot. So self-awareness, therefore, for me, is a constant process. I think the old definition was, you know, discover yourself, understand your past, and then we used to think personality was something very stable, but now we know it changes. So I think it's something that needs to be practiced daily because of the change we are always surrounded by.
One of the changes I think we see is just a lot more tolerance, freedom to be honest about these things. Vulnerability is a word I'm hearing at the corporate senior levels more than I've ever heard before. So it's something people are practicing. I had a new CEO yesterday just tell his team something he had never told his other company in 10 years of being there. And they were deeply appreciative of the honesty and the candor to understand him at a different level. And so I think there's so much more encouragement and push and tolerance and acceptance of showing these human sides. And with COVID, you know, we were joking before the session started, but at any moment, one of my teenagers might wander in this room, and you're going to find out I'm not just doing this job, but I'm also a mother and a dog owner, and who knows what else might happen. And I'm seeing it everywhere. And some of the most, you know, senior leaders in the biggest companies in the world, with children wandering around and grandchildren crying in the background. And it turns out we're human. It turns out we have these other parts of us, and it's almost impossible to hide now. And it's extremely freeing. So it's always been important, but I almost feel like we have a new license to show those parts of ourselves that weren't okay not that long ago.
Yeah, I think that's really kind of resonating. I kind of noticed that as well. Just there's an air of authenticity and kind of honesty that we can kind of have now. Like we can see into each other's houses in ways that we only showed up in the office. Now I can see, okay, you have those things on your bookshelf, or you have that kind of crazy artwork, and it's like, before, maybe we would feel a bit protective of those things, but now we are much more honest with ourselves and kind of proud of our authenticity, I guess. I think maybe before we felt more of a need to maybe conform or to kind of fit into maybe a certain perspective or a certain mold, whereas now, given kind of the change, we're able to rebuild kind of how we want to move forward. But then that kind of like leads to something I was thinking about. A lot of these, the license to be self-aware and the license to be humble, like starts really with kind of creating that psychological safety or shifting that culture within your team and then also within your organization. Like, how do we do that? How can leaders like role model self-awareness as this cultural kind of cornerstone within their organization? That's a big question.
Well, I think you said it already almost in your question. It's about role modeling it as a first step. So practicing what you preach. So first, as leaders, becoming self-aware and being very transparent about who you are at a deep level. Because a lot of the times it stops with that, right? Leaders want to know other people, but they're not comfortable sharing their own dark sides, right? So that's the first step. So know yourself, know the impact you have. So what we do with clients, we encourage them to have leadership contracting conversation with their new hires and their startups to say, okay, not just what do I expect of you, performance-wise and values-wise, but also what kind of leadership do you expect from me, which shows, you know, that you're not a perfect person. Even if you're in a leadership position, you are human, and you have your strengths, you have your weaknesses. So being transparent and showing that you as a leader care about personal growth and know and are humble to receive feedback and give feedback. That's actually the number one thing, I think, because people should look up to you and they work for you.
Interesting. I think that, the startup culture, like stereotypically, is very like bravado and kind of overconfident. Kind of introducing that humility is a real counter to kind of how this kind of environment typically operates. I mean, I know that you work at this idea of, you have your kind of tribes program. Would you mind just explaining a little bit about it? Because I think that's really kind of key to changing not only the culture within your organization, but actually within the community as a whole.
Yes, Tribes is a program where we go even deeper than you would expect, because in startups, as most of you probably know, the line between professional and personal is very blurred, because as a founder, this is very much your baby and very much part of you most of the time. So it's a program where we help people have deeper conversation about their lives, not just professionally, but personally. Anything goes, talking about vulnerability. So no topic is inappropriate. And it helps founders and people to really understand themselves and be comfortable being real. And we see that it helps create leadership skills, because you're taught to listen to other people's stories and take your biases. Don't let your biases impact you so much.
Interesting. Yeah. And Jessica, I mean, with Scaling for Growth, it's somewhat similar, right?
It is. Yeah. I mean, it's deep diving into data and information that helps us round out our understanding, figuring out what the implications. We always get back to how are other people experiencing that. I think at the very beginning of this, Lara, your description of self-awareness, there's a lot of in there that's about authenticity and who we are, but ultimately how we show up is how we lead. And so, the ways people experience us is ultimately what we're really focused on. And when we do these programs, that's a lot of hearing from other people, creating safe spaces, as you say, to talk about those things, saying thank you when you get feedback, because it'll encourage people to give you more. And one of the things we always joke with leaders about is, if you stop hearing feedback, it didn't go away. You're just the only one who doesn't know, but everyone else still knows. It's still everyone else's truth. They know, and it's the wisdom of the crowd. If you kind of go out and listen in the hallways of anything from a tiny company to a big one, there are very similar stories about a leader. The difference is only whether that leader happens to know what those stories are.
Yeah. And it seems like there has been maybe one solution to this is to kind of be seeking out feedback more and more and creating a culture of feedback. Do you see, I remember when the idea of internal social networking platforms kind of first came around, and there was like Yammer and all these others that unsurprisingly had a very slow adoption. And I don't think are really around anymore. But I see there's this new innovation coming around kind of platforms and tools to kind of get more upward feedback. Do you see organizations are more kind of prepared or kind of willing to adopt these kind of tools and technologies now to kind of source that feedback, get more data about themselves?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly a trend to move away from the annual performance model, or once a year we tell you some things, but some of this data is 9 months old, and it would have been really helpful to hear, along the way, to moving towards a much more agile and ongoing, even wearables that are giving daily feedback on maybe just what quadrant you're in. Are you creating energy for me? Or are you draining my energy as a leader? Something as simple as that can help someone calibrate ongoing. But and ongoing really matters. I think what we do is underestimate the small things we do along the way that have huge impact, because we forget we're so powerful in these leadership jobs and our shadow is so big. And small words like using the word efficiency drives people to think we're about to make layoffs when we may just be talking about, changing one spreadsheet. And, a simple behavior can have such ripple effects that you need ongoing correction to to walk back some of those comments or to clarify them, or you know, to really make it clear what you really mean. Otherwise, you have an entire enterprise going out and acting and behaving and making choices that may actually be completely counter to what your intent was.
Yeah, Lara.
Yes, similar. Within the startup world, actually, one of the most common questions we get is, how do we use psychometrics? And what, I heard psychometrics can be useful, but I only know one, and how do I use them? So there's definitely an appetite, and people understand this, but they don't know how to apply them and why even. So that's sometimes what we do. But when it comes to feedback, can I just say something about my experience with that? Is that some of our clients actually, especially females, would benefit from maybe less of the external, the feedback, hearing from others, because they're naturally wired to understand other people's perceptions, care about what other people think of them, and they do tend to listen. But what we recommend for them is to actually take some more time to introspect and just listen to their instinct, which they've lost touch with. So for them, actually less feedback, or judging feedback in a different way in combination with introspection, confidence in their inner voice, is more helpful. So, but for some who are naturally more impulsive or selfish, there more feedback or more focus on feedback would be recommended, in my experience. So it's about understanding your baseline, because I feel like sometimes getting more feedback can have depending on the type of people, can have a bad effect on some people, right?
Yeah.
I really agree with you on that. I mean, and we know that it puts people in a threat state. They retreat, they feel, and none of us are at our best when we're feeling defensive and smaller as a person. So finding a way to get feedback in a way that is growth oriented, that is positive. And in fact, Reese, we've even really been thinking about how to dial back the level of how much feedback people are getting, and giving it in small increments that are really relevant to what's happening now. When you give people an enormous amount all at once, they can't even absorb it. It's too much. It's too much to see about ourselves on a piece of paper. I mean, a woman, you know, I bump into someone in the supermarket and they get mad at me. It's going to take me 3 hours to recover. You tell me that I'm a terrible leader, it's going to take me years to recover. So, you know, it really, I really agree with your point. It can be as damaging as it can be helpful if it's not done right.
And so to that point, so Lara, you mentioned psychometrics, and it'd be interesting to know a little bit more about kind of how you use different data-driven tools within those small kind of startups, right? Because I think, you know, we often think of maybe psychometric tools to be used kind of at scale in high volume. How would you use it kind of to help leaders as they build out their founding teams? What does that process look like?
We start by understanding their goals, because there needs to be a motivation, a buy-in for the tool. Yeah, right. So a lot of people don't like receiving feedback, or they're very skeptical about it, and it's quite annoying filling in questions sometimes. So we start by understanding what, and giving them some kind of emotional energy to then dive into the feedback and the profile, and understanding what is helping or hindering them in reaching that goal. So the first step is goal, then the second step is using psychometrics or other data-driven tool, and then the next step is about embodiment, because we really believe you can change. You can change who you are if you really want to, if you're motivated. So who do you need to become? Who am I? Who do I want to become? And then we go into action, because we find that sometimes we in the past we went too fast to action mode without really understanding the whole person that they want to become, personally and professionally. So the action didn't really land with them. So that's the 4 steps for us.
Interesting. Jessica, how does that kind of sound to you? Do you have a similar approach when you're, say, coaching the CEO of a large enterprise?
Yeah. Well, I think, as you know, a lot of the data gathering we do is really for succession. And so there's a burden to really get a holistic picture of a person and figure out where they're fitting in the pipeline. And that's one use of that data. but we can be selective in how a person receives that feedback as an individual. It's our ethic as a firm that we should be as transparent with the person as we've been with the company. And so it's important that we tell them the same story that we're telling a company, but you have to do it in the right ways, which means you have to create trust. You have to sit with a person and help them understand you're in service of their growth and in their progress as a leader. If you're seen as someone who is just an instrument or a tool to give candor, but without a good bit of care, then you can't get someone to a place of learning. So it's that constant balance between total candor and honesty, but humanity and empathy and pacing that a person can tolerate. And it's very hard to get it just right. And I think it's just an ongoing balancing act.
Yeah, true. It's like, how do we get that kind of balance of being kind of giving kind of constructive kind of feedback that could be slightly difficult to kind of receive, while also still kind of supporting people and kind of trying to build people up so they kind of have that confidence. Okay, so before I switch to the to some Q&A, I just want to kind of round out our conversation by asking you both, are there kind of 2 or 3 really practical things that people can practice today if they're looking to become a more self-aware leader or a manager?
I'll give one and then I'll let you give one. I like truth tellers around us, people that you trust, people that you know are in this for your own growth. And, you know, if I were to ask you when's the last time someone gave you developmental feedback and you can't recall, then you need to go out and find it, because it's out there. You haven't become perfect in the interim. You just lost the avenues of insight and people who are willing to be honest with you. And if you're getting a lot of people telling you what they think you want to hear, you've created an environment in which you're really not going to hear the real story. So finding your truth tellers is I think a powerful tool within an enterprise.
Lara?
This is a good one. And maybe to add, to help you connect to your inner self more and the things that drive you and that spark your passion, I think a simple question of, you know, what was the highlight of last month for you? What was the highlight of last year for you? Where were you? Who were you around? What was going on? That helps you understand a lot about when you are at your best, and, you know, helps you hopefully find touch with your inner true self and what that means. So reflecting on that is one thing. And another thing is, what I like to do is really simple feedback exercise you can do, just asking the question of what is one thing that if I changed about myself would help me grow as a person? And then ask this to your boyfriend, girlfriend, husband, wife, colleague, best friend, family, as many people as you want to. And I do it regularly, and it's always so interesting what people say. And yeah, even when you're someone who gets a lot of feedback, asking this, we often forget to really ask and really listen to the response to people we're close with. And that really helps you with the external side of self-awareness, I think.
I think that's, yeah, those points are really interesting. This idea of seeking out, those truth tellers, well, actively seeking out feedback and reflecting on kind of what engages and motivates you. I think there's a difference between kind of the feedback people are willing to give us versus the feedback that we actually want. And so kind of asking people, what about me do I need to change, is quite a provocative question that people aren't going to just naturally tell you. They may kind of come around at different angles, but actually actively seeking that out is can be really profound. And as well, it's this idea that, I don't know about you both, but over the last kind of 4 or 5 months, as we've been in kind of lockdown, it feels like it's gone on forever, but also just kind of been just a few seconds. You know, it feels like everything's moving faster, but taking longer at the same time. And so that's really got me thinking, like, just kind of how we just move from one thing to the next. And we can, at the time, we think, okay, this is a good decision, this is a bad decision, and so on. But we rarely kind of step back and kind of see the bigger picture, like what actually, inspires me and motivates me. How should I be orientating my life and my career around that?
Yeah. The time to reflect is rarely part of what we prioritize in our, Tom made a really an interesting point in the chat that I so agree with, that which we really haven't talked as much about, but positive feedback is enormously powerful. I can't tell you the number of times a leader has pulled out an old shabby handwritten card that someone wrote for them maybe years ago that continues to be a source of strength for them. And we're all going to be better. I'm not a strength-based person. I mean, I think we have to know both sides of ourselves, not just one side. It's unrealistic. But I will tell you, having given thousands of feedback sessions, everyone hones in on the critical feedback in an instant, even when it's this much and there's a page full of positive things. That's where our attention and our energy goes. And sometimes I now cover the page when we were in live and say, let's just spend some time on these strengths. Can we celebrate them? Because they're really important to your success. Yeah,
that's so true. And I think it's, I'm also kind of on the weakness side of things. Like that's where I normally go if I'm looking for feedback or thinking about just feedback in general. But you're right. It's this idea, we all have your own unique talents. And that's the whole purpose of being self-aware, is that we likely have strengths that we aren't really aware of or we're not leveraging. It's just as important to get aware about those things as well as kind of our gaps and our risk factors. So that was super helpful. And I definitely, I'm going to try to surround myself with some more truth tellers, that's for sure. So I'm just going to pull up the chat and kind of read out some questions that people have put forward. Okay, so this one is to you, Jessica. With the current focus on diversity and inclusion, how does a leader's self-awareness, say, help or hinder those goals within corporate environments?
Yeah, I mean, there's been no bigger pivot in our daily work than the shift, particularly within the US over the last few months, and within heightened conversation around race and diversity and racial equality. And what we are finding is that when you find that you're in a position to address these really challenging issues, the first step is you have to explore your own relationship with those things, your relationship with race, how you think about that, the experiences you've had, the things that have shaped the ways you think about them. Because we've seen some pretty meaningful missteps when leaders have come out with a position that doesn't ring true, that doesn't ring authentic, that doesn't feel like they've internalized their own point of view. And in contrast, we've seen leaders come out with perspectives that are powerful and felt emotionally and connected to their own experience. And the difference is known and it's felt by their employee base, by their consumers, by their customers. So this idea of self-awareness is absolutely the first step before you wade into something as risky but crucial as a conversation around diversity.
And Lara, like, how does that ring true within the startup world? Again, there are increasingly, it's a white male dominated kind of industry. How can we use self-awareness to build up minority and kind of female-led ventures? How can we do that, right? And remove some of that bias.
Very similar answer. I guess it's about the leaders first accepting who they really are, because if you don't accept who you are, how can you accept people who are different from you? Right? So that starts with doing your own work, and then using more objective tools like psychometrics and recruitment to complement the interview process, so that you are not just hiring people just like you and going against your instincts consciously using structured interviews. So we always recommend that people hire people who are really different from them, and so yeah, it's using objective tools and working on yourself so that you can embrace people that are different from you.
Very good. Okay, so this one comes from Stefan. And provocatively, he asks, is there an advantage to being unaware? For example, does knowing that you're being undervalued actually help performance?
No. Oh, it's interesting. Well, I mean, one of the problems I have with high potential programs is that I'm not going to be the person to tell you don't have potential. I don't want to be in the business of deciding that there are two kinds of people in the world. You guys, you're good. You have potential and you're going to do big things. And you think you just kind of sit there and tread water because you're not going anywhere. I think it's an absurd notion. And so, you know, if part of being unaware is lists that put us in boxes that are categorical and don't fully represent ourselves, I'm kind of in favor of that. In fact, let's just not make the lists so we don't have to hide them. You know, and the way, so maybe there's a little argument for that. For the most part, I'm not going to argue for a lot of blissfully unaware, but man, it makes people happy. So maybe there's a little value there.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to what I was trying to say before. There's some of us who get very self-conscious very easily because we don't trust ourselves naturally. So sometimes it is good to be unaware of what people think of you, depending on their intentions or how they matter to you, and actually focus more on tuning into your own awareness. So it depends. I can see where this question might be coming from.
So just going back to the conversation we had around diversity and inclusion. So when we look at kind of the data within funded startups, it's overwhelmingly like skewing towards kind of male founders, male leaders. Do you find in your experience that and this applies to the corporate world as well, a general gap in self-awareness between male and female leaders? And then kind of how does that kind of impact the way that they're able to kind of lead their ventures to maybe secure funding or expand out their business?
Yeah, we do find, I mean, I don't have hard data, but we do find that female founders are a lot more receptive sometimes to this work we do, the coaching, because they tend to be a lot more insecure, which has advantages. And they tend to care more about creating an inclusive culture and growing slowly versus scaling for the sake of scale. Of course, this is massive generalization, but yeah, we find that they tend to want to focus on their team and grow slowly versus aggressively scaling, and which happens a lot. I don't know if that answers the question, but yeah.
We find, so empirically, we evaluate leaders on 9 dimensions, and on 8 of those 9, we see 0 gender differences, totally equal across the 8. And the only place we see a difference is on a dimension we call knowing yourself, which is essentially our self-awareness dimension, in which women score on average about 10% higher than men. So still a pretty small difference, but it's the only gender difference we see across thousands of leaders in almost every country on the planet, and the pattern replicates in every region of the world. And you know, when we've gotten under some of those reasons, it appears to be in part driven not by the fact that they're at their core less self-aware, but that societally the messages to them from an entire life to men have been show strength. And sometimes show strength and hide vulnerability is the enemy of self-awareness. And so, you know, it's not a capability gap so much, I think often a message from their own upbringings and the world around them, encouraging some people to be more open with how they think and feel and who they are, and some people to be a bit more guarded among that. But we are seeing progress in that. We're seeing some shifts in the data and some generational differences that suggest, you know, within even a generation or 2, we might see some real change in that area.
That's great to hear. And I think you're right. I think when we think about so much of a behavior, we obviously know aspects of us are kind of stable across different environments and so on. But the culture that we find ourselves in within our team, our organization, society, country, and so on, all kind of has this compounding effect on kind of how we communicate and share aspects of ourselves. And so there's things that we need to do to kind of become more self-aware and better leverage our strengths and manage our gaps. But also it's about pushing to create those environments for others as well. I think there's a duty that we all kind of have to create an environment that is comfortable for others to be self-aware just as much as their own.
Yeah. And we've seen, shifts happen in entire corporations.
Wow.
Because one leader at the top, at the C-suite level, starts modeling a behavior that's so different than historically has been shown. And you'll see a sea change, at so many levels, because it's like permission was given at the most powerful levels to start behaving differently and, admitting to failures, which, as we know, is one of the biggest steps towards creating a more risk-taking and an entrepreneurial culture, and which I'm sure Lara is much more used to seeing. I see kind of slow-moving, risk-averse corporate life a little bit more, but creating environments where that's safe is crucial with the kind of growth these companies want to achieve.
Totally agree.
Just one final question before we round out. So now that we're working in this remote environment, obviously the ability to give feedback is very different now. Do you have any suggestions or kind of practical recommendations people can make when they're wanting to both seek out and provide feedback to, say, their direct reports, their colleagues, and so on? How can that, whereas before we can just kind of pull people aside or have a conversation over coffee, how do we model that out in a way that is respectful, but also impactful as we're working remotely?
In my experience, it's about setting time aside every month or even every week, depends on your preference and your culture and your team, but to have almost a ceremony of feedback celebrated, to make it really fun, to not create this anxiety, right? So it's a give and takes, right? So you listen and then you listen to the other person, and you take the time to have a conversation and be authentic about it and combine it with the data that you hopefully have gathered about that person early on in the working relationship, on their goals and their strengths and their weaknesses, so that you can track their growth. So having conversation about motivation, strength, weaknesses, growth, and future. I think future is very important to focus on to motivate people. So where are you going? Who are you becoming as a person? How can I help you? And vice versa. I think it's important to have very equal level conversation, even if one person is more senior than the other, because it's in the end, like Jessica said, it's just two human beings with two different areas of focus having a conversation and to bring out the best in each other. So that's what I like to do.
I like that. Feedback ceremony. I'm going to start using that. That's
I've never heard that word. I like it. Yeah. And implies that this is a good thing. It's about growth. And I really like the routine idea Lara's bringing up, particularly when we don't have the natural rhythm and ebb and flow of being live, although many people have been working virtual for quite a long time. My other only piece of advice on this is at this moment in time, we have to be amping up our empathy level in ways that we don't have the luxury of pretending anymore that people have these two worlds, their home and their work. And if you've got children with young kids at home with no daycare solution, how could they possibly be operating at the level and the type of time and emotional commitment that they did 6 months ago? It's not possible to ask that of people. And if you don't know what they have going on, you can't then calibrate your feedback. You can't even start the conversation before you've asked the question, how are you and what's going on in your life and how can I help you? And that's what will give you the permission, even the right to even consider a conversation around feedback.
Yeah, I couldn't agree anymore. Like, just empathy is what's needed and kind of really sits at the heart of all of this. So thank you to you both. That was a really amazing conversation. I feel like we kind of toured really everything from technology to kind of the soft stuff around why we should be self-aware to much more practical issues that are facing us today. So thank you to everyone for attending. We're going to be hosting this on our YouTube channel, so stay tuned for a link to that. It will be emailed to you later today. And if you have any further questions for myself or the speakers, feel free to email me at reese@deepersignals.com, and we can get you some answers to those interesting questions. So with that, thank you very much and have a great day.
Thank you.